Louise Ellis was born on June 23, 1948, in Ottawa, Canada. She was known as a talented writer, illustrator, and freelance journalist, and was drawn to stories of injustice, always seeking truth in the lives of others. Unfortunately, her life would turn into a nightmare after meeting and falling in love with a prisoner by the name of Brett Morgan. In 1992, she began covering the case of David Milgaard, who was wrongfully convicted for the murder of Gail Miller. The real killer was Larry Fisher, and his cellmate and the one testifying against him was Brett. When Louise heard Brett's testimony, she felt he was a changed man and saw his life as a story of redemption. She then decided to reach out to him. Through letters and visits, she fell for his carefully crafted persona. When he was released, she welcomed him into her home, but it wouldn't be long before his welcome was very worn out. In her diary, Louise documented their fights, the way Brett poured beer over her head in fits of rage, and how he punched a hole through a door. By January 1995, she had asked him to leave, but after a break-in at her home, she allowed him to briefly return. She then discovered that Brett had stolen over $12,000 from her personal accounts. Brett had a history of manipulation and violence. His first wife, Sandra, who had gotten pregnant, believed she was marrying an 18-year-old man, but Brett had lied and was only 15. Their relationship quickly turned into a nightmare of control and cruelty. Sandra endured suffocation, brutal beatings, and a miscarriage caused by his fist. When she finally gathered the courage to escape, Brett assaulted her one last time, gun in hand. Thankfully, she made it out alive, but just barely. His second wife, Christine, met him in 1975. At first, he seemed charming, but the facade crumbled when she uncovered his lies about their finances. She tried to leave, but Brett lashed out, choking her on the side of the road. She managed to flee and later divorced him, but his evil side only worsened. In 1978, his violence turned deadly. He lured 21-year-old Gwen Telford into a hotel room where he strangled her to death. Though convicted of manslaughter, he was back on the streets in a mere 10 years. By then, he had a lengthy criminal record consisting of fraud, theft, and breaking and entering. Unfortunately, once Louise made the decision to confront Brett about the stolen money, her fate was sealed. On April 22, 1995, 46-year-old Louise vanished from her home in Ottawa. 2 days later, Louise's car was found with her purse and overnight bag locked inside. Brett played the concerned partner, making emotional pleas to the media and organizing search parties. At some point, a woman named Marie Parent, who was studying to be a private detective, decided to look into Louise's case as a final assignment. She spoke with Brett and began noticing some inconsistencies in his story and started suspecting him of being involved. The more she helped him, the more she gained his trust. Then, on July 5th, police instructed Marie to get Brett out of the house so they could plant a wire in his truck. So she took him to a restaurant to eat, and while there, he began making advancements toward her. After arriving back at Morgan's home, they agreed to meet the following day to continue the search for Louise. That search took them to the woods near Sainte-Cécile-d'Amacham, Quebec. While out walking, Marie noticed something just 30 feet away. She pointed it out, and Brett immediately said, "That's Louise." How did he know? When questioned, he claimed to have seen her running shoe. It was the slip-up investigators had been waiting for. That same day, Brett Morgan was arrested for her murder. Investigators believe that on the night of April 22, 1995, Louise had planned to visit an ex-boyfriend to celebrate his daughter's birthday. Investigators believe she confronted Brett about the stolen money late that night. Enraged, he attacked her, suffocating her in the bathroom of her own home. He then wrapped her lifeless body in a shower curtain, drove her deep into the Quebec wilderness, and left her among the trees. To cover his tracks, he dumped her body near her ex-boyfriend's home in an attempt to frame him. His trial in the fall of 1997 lasted 6 months and had over 90 witnesses testify. In the end, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. However, his stay was short because he died 2 months later from hepatitis C. Investigators still believe he is a prime suspect in the murder of 2 young women who were found in a remote area outside of Edmonton, strangled to death. On February 14, 2025, police were called to an apartment to perform a welfare check after the landlord raised concerns about the lack of communication since December and missed rent since October. When authorities entered the home, they found 3 children, a 15-year-old boy and 2 girls ages 12 and 13, living in unimaginable filth. The boy had been sleeping on a mattress on the floor while his sister slept on pizza boxes. The conditions were so horrific that police evidence technicians had to wear hazmat suits to process the scene. The next part is going to truly shock you. It turns out that their mother, 34-year-old Kelly Marie Bryant, had abandoned the kids at the home 4 or 5 years ago, and they were only able to survive because of a weekly food drop-off by Kelly and sometimes an unidentified stranger. The home had no running water, and trash was stacked 4 feet high. That trash consisted of mold and human waste. The bathroom also had serious issues. The toilet was overflowing, and there was feces in the bathtub. The children were so neglected that their toenails had curled under their feet, making it painful to walk. They also hadn't attended school since their abandonment, lacking essential hygiene products, and were found wearing soiled clothing. The girls, in particular, showed signs of not having left the home in years and appeared unfamiliar with personal hygiene practices, including how to flush a toilet. They passed the time by watching television and playing games. Unfortunately, they went largely unnoticed due to the no-contact delivery service during the pandemic. Since they never came outside, neighbors had no clue children even lived there. Once investigators located Kelly, they took her into custody and charged her with 3 counts of first-degree child abuse. Due to the severity of the case, the judge set her bond at $250 million. Meanwhile, the kids were taken to the hospital for evaluation and have since been placed in the custody of a relative. Kelly's next court appearance is scheduled for March 4, 2025. As of now, she remains in jail and is facing life in prison if convicted. Shirley Mae Merritt was born on September 27, 1941, in Clark County, Mississippi. She later became a devoted mother and grandmother and was known for her kindness that knew no bounds. At 77 years old, she had spent years supporting her family, never realizing that the son she had fought so hard to protect would be the one to betray her in the most horrifying way. To outsiders, the Merritt family seemed perfect, but behind closed doors, there was tension. Richard Merritt had always been a master manipulator, a fact even his own brother acknowledged. During his childhood, Richard lived a life of luxury in Saudi Arabia with his parents, Shirley and Robert Sr., after his father retired from the military and took on a lucrative job as a defense contractor. His older brother, Robert Jr., who was in graduate school at the time, recalls that this period made a lasting impression on Richard, who became obsessed with wealth and status. When Richard moved back to the U.S. for school, he lived with Robert Jr. in Atlanta. Even then, Robert described his younger brother as entitled and lazy, treating him as his personal cook and chauffeur. Richard went on to study law, struggling at first to pass the bar exam, failing multiple times before finally succeeding. He married his college sweetheart, but Robert Jr. claims Richard's ambitions were never about justice or helping others. He only wanted money, power, and the high life. After building a legal career, Richard worked for the Georgia Attorney General's office and several law firms before opening his own practice in 2010. By then, he was married with 2 children and living in Smyrna, Georgia, presenting himself as a successful, respected attorney. But in 2017, the illusion of success crumbled when he was sued for fraud. Richard had settled a lawsuit for 2 sisters without their knowledge and pocketed their $70,000 settlement. That discovery led to a deeper investigation, revealing that he had stolen over $450,000 from at least 17 victims, many of whom were elderly. He then lost his law license, his career, and his family. His wife filed for divorce and sought full custody of their children. Despite the severity of his crimes, Shirley remained devoted to her son. She paid his legal fees, bailed him out of jail, and even convinced authorities to let him live with her while awaiting trial. She believed she could protect and help him, but her unwavering support would prove to be a fatal mistake. In January 2019, Richard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of theft, forgery, and elder abuse, receiving a 15-year prison sentence. The judge granted him 2 weeks to get his affairs in order before reporting to prison, under the condition that he wear an ankle monitor and remain at Shirley's home in DeKalb County. When the day of his surrender arrived, Richard didn't turn himself in. Investigators later discovered his ankle monitor had been cut off and tossed in a trash can at a gas station. Authorities issued an alert, but it was already too late. The next day, February 2, 2019, Shirley was found murdered in her home. She had been stabbed so violently that the knife handle broke, leaving the blade embedded in her face. Nearby, a 35-pound barbell, covered in blood and hair, lay on the floor. It was a brutal and senseless killing. Authorities immediately suspected Richard, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Shirley had been cooking Richard a last meal of spaghetti before he was supposed to leave for prison. The table was still set for 2, food was left simmering on the stove, and a knife was missing from the kitchen block, the same knife used in the murder. There were no signs of forced entry and no sign of a struggle. The only things missing from the home were Shirley's car and cell phone. For the next 8 months, Richard evaded capture. He changed his identity, adopting the name Mick Malvo, and started a new life in Nashville, Tennessee. He even found a job and a new girlfriend through a dating app. But in September 2019, his downfall began when he parked his mother's car with a fake license plate at Vanderbilt University, where police quickly discovered it. Investigators searched the car and found a fake Louisiana ID with Richard's face, as well as receipts that allowed authorities to track his movements. He was then arrested without incident and charged with his mother's murder. All the while, Richard maintained his innocence. At trial, he claimed that 2 armed men had stormed the house, killed his mother in front of him, threatened his family, and then let him go. He never told this story to law enforcement, only unveiling it for the first time when he took the stand in his own defense. The jury wasn't convinced. During the trial, another strange detail emerged. Shirley, Richard's ex-wife, and his former attorney had all received anonymous, hand-drawn cartoons depicting a courtroom scene. Some of the drawings featured Disney's Huey, Dewey, and Louie in a rowboat, while others made veiled threats about the justice system. Richard's former attorney testified that he believed Richard created the drawings himself. While the exact idea behind the drawings remains a mystery, some believe he was trying to pass them off as coming from someone that was threatening him and his family. It's a really strange part of the case that, I'll be honest, I don't fully understand, and I don't think anyone does. Richard's DNA and fingerprints were never found at the crime scene, which his defense team used to argue reasonable doubt, but prosecutors countered that he lived in the home and had plenty of time to clean up. Surveillance footage placed him driving Shirley's car after the murder. Location data from Shirley's phone placed it in the same area where Richard had removed his ankle monitor. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Richard Merritt was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a weapon during a felony. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 5 additional years. After his conviction, Richard filed an appeal, claiming he had received ineffective legal representation. He argued that his trial attorney should have objected when his ex-wife testified about a past domestic violence incident and should have called additional witnesses to support his claims. The judge denied his request for a new trial, ruling that none of his arguments would have changed the outcome. Even if Richard were somehow acquitted of murder, he still faced a 30-year sentence in Cobb County for fraud and elder abuse. His brother, Robert Jr., had no sympathy for him. He believes Richard manipulated their mother for years, using her for money, bullying her into submission, and ultimately taking her life when she was no longer useful to him, and he feels his brother is where he deserves to be. On February 13, 2009, Frank Garcia, a nursing supervisor, learned that he had been fired from Lakeside Memorial Hospital in Brockport, New York, following accusations of sexual harassment from 2 coworkers. This wasn't Garcia's first dismissal. He had also been fired from Wesley Gardens nursing home in Rochester after similar allegations. However, this time, the firing would send Frank Garcia to a very dark place and lead to a horrible tragedy. In the early hours of Valentine's Day, February 14, 2009, at around 5 a.m. outside Lakeside Memorial Hospital, 23-year-old certified nursing assistant Mary Silliman walked out to the parking lot to smoke a cigarette. As she was standing there, Garcia approached and began assaulting her. A Good Samaritan, who went by Randy, saw the ordeal and decided to intervene. Unfortunately, that was a big mistake because Garcia was equipped with a .40 caliber Glock. After shooting Randy, he turned the gun on Randy's girlfriend, Audra Dillon, wounding her in the arm as she fled. Before Garcia left the scene, he sadly executed Mary. He then drove 50 miles east to Canandaigua and began going door to door along Middle Cheshire Road until he located the home of Kimberly Glatz and her husband, Christopher. Once there, he forced his way inside and then held the couple and their 2 teenage children captive for 3 hours. During that time, he forced Christopher to write farewell notes to his loved ones before ordering both adults to lie down. He then shot them execution style in the back of the head while their terrified children remained upstairs. Before leaving, Garcia taunted the children, forcing them to thank him for sparing their lives. Investigators would soon learn that Mary Silliman and Kimberly Glatz were the 2 individuals who accused him of sexual harassment. Due to the harassment complaint, Kimberly had received $25,000 as compensation. This angered Garcia, and while holding the couple hostage, he demanded that amount but would never get it. Upon leaving the scene, he took Christopher's cell phone and called his wife, Margie Ann Garcia, and told her to watch the news and confess to having hurt someone, though he did not elaborate. Later that day, Garcia surrendered to police at a Tim Hortons in Rochester, still carrying the .40 caliber Glock used in the killings. Ballistics confirmed the weapon was used in the murders. Despite his defense team's claims of insufficient evidence, forensic analysis and eyewitness testimonies tied Garcia directly to the murders. In 2010, Garcia was convicted of first-degree murder for the killings of Kimberly and Christopher Glatz and received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with 2 additional 25-year sentences for the kidnapping of the couple's teenage children. In Monroe County, he was also convicted of 2 additional murders for the deaths of Mary Silliman and Randall Norman, as well as the attempted murder of Audra Dillon. In 2017, an appellate court vacated Garcia's life sentence related to the attempted murder charge, but upheld his other convictions. His sentence for the killings of the Glatz couple was later modified from consecutive life sentences to concurrent life terms. Regardless, Garcia remains incarcerated at Attica Correctional Facility. Throughout the investigation, police discovered Garcia's pattern of predatory behavior, which included prior allegations of harassment at multiple healthcare facilities. Investigators concluded that Garcia's violent rampage stemmed from a desire for revenge against those who had exposed his misconduct. Despite his heinous crimes, Garcia never expressed remorse for his actions.
Or we both have listened to Mrs. Dillon in 2009 and today on her cries for justice. But I herein shall declare to Ms. Dillon, you are in error, and no, those piercing eyes you claimed of noticing that dark morning from 21 plus feet away is a fabrication. I've taken notice but your perjury is between the Creator Yahweh, Jehovah, and your account on the great white seat of judgment.
And judges across multiple trials described him as a dangerous and disturbing psychopath who should never be released. Waymon Keith Gentry was born on September 2, 1974, in Waco, Texas, to Waymon and Glenda, and went by Keith. Keith grew up in Robinson, Texas, and later married Darlene Doskaseel on April 10, 1999, and they went on to have 3 sons. A devoted husband, father, son, and friend, Keith was well loved by those who knew him. Keith, a corrections officer, and Darlene, a nurse, seemed to have an idyllic life. That is, until a horrible tragedy occurred just 6 years into their marriage. On the morning of November 9, 2005, at 6:11 a.m., Darlene called 911 to report that Keith had been shot in their home after an intruder broke in. When police arrived, they found Keith in the bedroom, barely alive, suffering from a gunshot wound to the head. He was rushed to the hospital, but later succumbed to his injuries. The moment police arrived on the scene, they noticed inconsistencies in Darlene's account. First of all, she was a nurse and had made no attempt to help Keith. There was also the matter of the break-in, but investigators could find no signs of forced entry. They also found it strange that Keith's guns were initially missing, but later found on the front lawn neatly stacked in a pile, except for one, a .22 caliber revolver. When Darlene was questioned about surviving the attack, she told investigators she had been asleep with her children in a different room when the intruder entered the home. At that point, they began digging into Keith and Darlene's relationship and discovered that their marriage was far from perfect. Friends of the couple told investigators that tensions in the marriage had been on the rise due to their financial struggles. They also discovered that Darlene stood to gain $500,000 from Keith's life insurance policy. At this point, they put Darlene on the suspect list and began surveilling her. That's when they caught her discarding a blood-stained pillowcase in a dumpster days after the murder. Then came the most damning evidence of all, when police discovered that Darlene had taken an interest in purchasing a piece of property with a pond on it. She had initially wanted the property so the children could fish, but after buying it, she abruptly requested the pond be filled in. Suspicious, authorities searched the pond, and unbeknownst to Darlene, they found Keith's missing .22 caliber revolver. They then set up surveillance on the pond and witnessed Darlene return, wade into the water, and search the exact spot where the gun had been found. She was then arrested and charged with Keith's murder. In the end, she was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison with eligibility for parole in 2037. Following her conviction, Keith's parents were granted custody of the couple's 3 sons. Then, in 2010, a court prohibited Darlene from any contact with them. Since the case largely rested on circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies in her story, and the pond video, some believe she is innocent or that her guilt was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. What do y'all think? Let me know in the comments below.